I'm Bill Mullen, and I teach classics at Bard College. I've done that since 1985. Classics I define as Greek and Latin language, literature, philosophy, history, mathematics, rhetoric, and athletics. I teach courses like Confucius and Socrates, India and Greece, poetry and athletics, which is global. It's 1/4 ancient Greek Olympic victor poetry, hula dance and chant and words, the Mesoamerican, the Mayan ball game and its epic, the Popol Vuh, and modern American baseball and basketball poetry. Now, part of that will be the catastrophist interpretation of athletics, the Mayan ball game. So I've been giving papers at conferences inspired by Emanuel Velikovsky, starting from the year in which I worked with him, 1973 to 4, which was a very important year in his life because there were 4 conferences about him at which he was present, and at which I was present in all but 1 cases, and for which I wrote essays which you can read. So I graduated from Harvard in 1968 and went to University of Texas at Austin to do get a PhD in classics. I had already visited there and made friends, one of whom was a brilliant mathematician, my age. And the first hour I spent reconnecting with him now that I had moved down there, he said, "Bill, have you ever heard of a book called Worlds at Collision?" I said, "No." The next night I was reading it, and the next 3 days I was reading it nonstop. And by great serendipity, Emanuel Velikovsky, the author of that book, came to Rice University in Houston 2 months later. And I and my mathematician buddy went right down there, and I was so impressed by him, so moved by him, that I went up afterwards and said, "Sir, I am a PhD candidate. I have summers free. If by any chance you should need a scholarly assistant in the advance of your work, I would like to offer my free services." And I did, and he accepted, and I did. I went. Not the next summer, but the one after that. I spent the summer in Princeton with Velikovsky, mostly in the library. And I knew I had taught myself Egyptian hieroglyphics. This was invaluable to him because his work depends a great deal on Egyptian texts, but he did not read the hieroglyphics, so I had my role. As a classicist, I had studied myth for 8 years, 9th grade in high school to senior year in college. I had also studied Freud. And Freud's work includes books like Totem and Taboo, which are efforts to reconstruct some collective trauma of mankind, over and above his work with individual patients, individual trauma. And Freud writes so persuasively that you get involved and you say, yeah, maybe there was a collective trauma for mankind. But what he comes up with, Freud, as the collective trauma, was a scenario in which you have the father and the women and the brothers. And the father is monopolizing the women, and the brothers are just feel like castrated wimps. So guess what they do? They gang up and kill him. But they feel guilty, and they're traumatized. I mean, it's just wild stuff. Where does he come up with this? I'll tell you where Freud came up with it. His disciples were like the brothers, and he was like the father. Anyway, all of that made me curious about whether there might be other scenarios one could reconstruct of a collective trauma for mankind. Well, when I read Worlds in Collision, I saw that trauma, and it was big time. It was not brothers denied the women by the father. It was a catastrophe, a global in scale, with involving activity in the sky that would have been terrifying. I said, okay, I'll buy this collective trauma. After my PhD, and I went to Berkeley as my first job as a professor, 71 to 73. And in 73, Dave Talbot and his brother Steve organized at Lewis and Clark University in Portland the first ever Immanuel Velikovsky symposium, I think. And I was the young one there, but I did give a paper which seemed to resonate with the audience, called The Center Holds. You can see it online. And if you Google it and then Google image it, you'll see me at that age with a beard, like a hippie. Not too big of a beard. The paper boldly asserted that Velikovsky's work means that every major scientific discipline will have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Geology, biology, physics, astrophysics, you name it. And then I was made the Hodder Fellow in the Humanities at Princeton, a postdoctoral fellow for 1973 to 4, and I got it, and I took it, and I went there, and I knew that Velikovsky was there because I'd spent the summer of 1970 there working for him. So Princeton University did not know that its fellowship was funding a radical heretic like me. And what I did for that year, they approved, was to take the oldest pyramid of Egypt with inscriptions in it, which we can read, the Pyramid of Unas, and to retranslate them and comment on them. Well, while doing that, I was trying to figure out a Velikovskyite catastrophist interpretation of those texts. I figured oldest texts around, in stone inside the chambers of the pyramids, must be valuable stuff. And my only obligation as the Hodder Fellow in the Humanities at Princeton was to give a talk in the spring about my year's work. And I did, to an elite audience of just about 20. And I invited Velikovsky, and he came. And I told the audience that this was part of my approach to these texts. In other words, I did not stay in the closet about this. I'm very proud of the fact that I rose to the honesty that my relationship to him demanded. And you know, these polite Princeton professors, they knew they didn't have to do anything about the fact that I was saying this, so they just listened, and that was it. So that same year was the year of 4 symposia. I had already met Dave Talbot at the Portland Symposium in 73. I met Wal Thornhill at a symposium in 74 at McMaster's University in Hamilton, Ontario, near Toronto. So that's how I met those two. We go way back.